In the year 1595, the German astronomer Johannes Kepler claimed to have an epiphany. While teaching in Graz, demonstrating the periodic conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter and the zodiac, he suddenly realized that regular polygons bound one inscribed and one circumscribed circle at definite ratios, which, he reasoned, might be the geometrical basis of our universe. This realization led him to his first major astronomical work in the form of a book entitled Mysterium Cosmographicum. It was published at Tübingen in 1597 and received a second edition in 1621, 9 years before his death. But before we dive deeper into the book, I would like to give you a rough overview about the way Kepler saw the world and how this influenced his proposed model of the universe. In addition to his astronomical research, Kepler systemized and extended all that was known about polyhedra in his time. Although he followed mostly a logical approach when he classified new types of polyhedra and discovered the infinite class of antiprisms, this does not mean that he was free of mysticism. For example, in his later book Harmonicae Mundi, in which he also discovered the third law of planetary motion, Kepler takes over the idea of the Greek philosopher Plato. Plato hypothesized that the classical elements were made out of the 5 regular Platonic solids. The element of fire, which is constructed by tetrahedrons, the element of wind by octahedrons, the element of earth and water by cubes and icosahedrons respectively, and then there was the mystical 5th element of the universe, created by dodecahedrons. In a time where there was no model of atoms and molecules that we have today, Kepler thought that if those 5 solids are the fundamental building blocks of the elements that make up the world, these 5 Platonics might also be represented in the largest scale of our universe. I will quickly go over the 5 regular Platonic solids, but if you would like to learn more about what makes those Platonic bodies special, check out the excellent video from the YouTube channel VSauce, which I linked in the video description. Now let's get back to the main title of this video. In the book Mysterium Cosmographicum, Kepler proposed that the distance relationships between the 6 planets known at the time could be understood in terms of the 5 Platonic solids. Each of those solids would be enclosed within a sphere, whose circumferences represents the orbit of the planets. With this in mind, Kepler created a hypothetical model of our solar system in the form of a large drawing, which embodies this idea. This was virtually the first attempt since Copernicus to say that the theory of heliocentrism, which means that the sun sits in the center of our solar system instead of the Earth, is physically true. Now let's take a closer look into this model. The interior of the inner sphere represents the Sun, which is enclosed by the orbit of our first planet of our solar system, Mercury. The sphere that represents Mercury's orbit is the inscribed sphere of the first Platonic body. The octahedron describes the element of fire in Plato's view and is the smallest of the polyhedra in the Mysterium Cosmographicum. Its circumscribed sphere represents the orbit of our second planet, Venus. Going out further, we reach the third Platonic body, the icosahedron. It resembles the element of water and its circumscribed sphere represents the orbit of the Earth. After that, we reach the dodecahedron, to which Plato curiously assigned the element of the universe, and its circumscribed sphere, which represents the orbit of Mars. With the inner planets out of the way, we move out to the 4th Platonic body, which is the tetrahedron. Its circumscribed sphere represents the orbit of Jupiter. And then last but not least, we come to the 5th Platonic body, which is a regular cube, and its circumscribed sphere, which is the orbit of Saturn. Now what makes this model so intriguing, apart from its visual appeal, is the fact that if one plots the normalized distances of the planets from the Sun, Kepler's model comes surprisingly close to the actual distances, which can only be explained by a great coincidence and probably some try and error in arranging the Platonic bodies. So with the introduction out of the way, we can now talk about the actual making of the model. I had 3 quite specific goals in mind. The first was the actual building of the model, and I already knew that I would be more than happy if this was the only point that I could accomplish. The second thing was that I wanted to have a LED sun in the center of the model because I thought it would look very cool if the light source in the center could cast some weird shadows of those complex shapes and objects onto the walls. And then for some reason I also had the idea of making the platonic bodies actually rotate around the center with the actual relative orbital periods that corresponded to our planets. I thought this would be probably the biggest and most complicated project I've ever tackled, and it wouldn't have surprised me if I wouldn't have finished it, because I might have run into some problems that I couldn't solve. That being said, I worked over a year on this project, and this is represented by the length of this video, so feel free to jump to any point of the video that might look interesting to you. I didn't want to speed up hundreds and hundreds of hours of work into a 5-minute video, because then you probably wouldn't even see what's happening. So I decided to make a longer video, talk about the steps that I'm doing, and if you're interested, feel free to watch the parts that are interesting to you or that might look interesting to you. Otherwise, you can also just skip to the reveal at the end and enjoy the finished model. I quickly wanted to talk about the idea I had for the sun. I knew that I wanted a small but bright LED light in a spherical diffuser, and the size of the sun will actually determine the size of the whole model, because this will be the smallest point of the whole model. I found a small 250 lumen LED which I decided to use, with a length of about 3.6 centimeters and a diameter of about 1.5 centimeters. And now my task was to find some sort of round diffuser that I could put around this LED to make it look like a sun. And after a lot of googling, funnily enough, I had the idea to just use a table tennis ball, because this actually has the perfect dimensions to fit this LED inside of it. So that's what I decided to use for the model, and now I could start calculating how large this model will get and how large all of the different platonic bodies will be. To do this, I wrote a little Python script that would calculate all of the different sizes and lengths I needed to cut. And everything started with this variable here, which is the radius of the table tennis ball, which is 2 centimeters. And you can see the largest cube here would have an edge length of 45 centimeters. And by just changing the radius of the table tennis ball by 5 millimeters, you can suddenly see the cube edge length increased by almost 10 centimeters. And you can also see that the outermost ring of the model would have a diameter of around 1 meter, which was way too large for my purposes. Another problem that I would be facing was that if you take a look at the model again, you can see that some of the elements are actually floating in mid-air. So there was no way that I could build it exactly the way it was presented. So I thought the easiest way to build it would be just to have some rod or tubes attached to those floating elements that will hold everything together. This is one of my earliest drawings where I started to think how to build this model, and there you can see that I thought about having different tubes stuck into each other, which would all rotate at different speeds in order to have the correct rotation speeds that would correspond to the orbital speeds that our planets have around the sun. The idea was to have large gears on the bottom of each tube, and each of those gears would then be driven by a set of gears that would translate the rotation of the motor into the correct orbital speed. To build the gearbox, I knew I would need some sort of thick base plate that I could put all of my gears onto, and I just took 2 big plates of oak wood. You can see me here gluing them together and then clamping them down in order to have a base plate. Here you can see me doing a test fit of all of the brass tubes I ordered online, and I decided to put a steel tube in the center that all of the brass tubes have an axis they can move around. Now I needed to find the center of the board, and I basically just used 2 cotton strings attached to the edges of the base plate, and by letting them cross each other I know exactly where the center of the board is. When I first put all of the brass tubes on top of the steel axis, I was a bit afraid that this wobbliness would cause an issue later, but as you will see in the end, I added a bearing to the outermost brass tube, which would alleviate the wobbling. Here you see me now trying to figure out which gears I need to buy, and I used a website called Gear Generator that helped me a lot with figuring out the correct gears that I would need to simulate the planetary motion. Once I figured out all the gears that I needed to buy, I made some paper templates in order to put together a first basic draft of my gear system and see if everything would fit into the dimensions that I had in mind. In a perfect world, these gears would be made from brass, but when I saw that one of those brass gears already costs around 10 euros, you can easily calculate the cost for around 40 gears that I would need for the project, and this would have just exploded the price of the whole project, so there was no way I would buy 40 different brass gears. So I ended up buying some polyacetal gears from the web shop called Madler, and those are cheap and very robust, so I was very happy with what I got there. In order to create the whole gear system, you can see me here drilling some holes for some ball bearings, which will then hold the axles to which the gears will be attached. And here you can see me fitting the first ball bearing with the steel axis into the hole that I drilled, just using some super glue. I actually wouldn't recommend using super glue to glue metal to wood. I would rather use 2-component glue, which I realized later when some of these ball bearings were coming off again. And just to be clear here, there are a lot of steps that just didn't work out. But I didn't include every failure of the project here in this video, otherwise this would be at least twice as long. You will mostly see the steps that actually worked. If I would build this whole thing again, I would probably do a lot of things more efficient and in a different way. And the fact that I didn't have a drill press at the time also made things much more difficult, because your hands are just not accurate enough in order to drill a 90-degree hole into wood. That's why you will also see me using some weird techniques in order to compensate some inaccuracies that were just caused by using hand tools. Here you can see me widening the hole of one of the gears using just a regular battery drill, and this is also the part where a drill press would be most useful. Since you have to operate the drill with your hands, you can't get a perfect perpendicular hole into this gear. And this means if you have a chain of multiple gears which all have not a perfect perpendicular hole, the gears will just not sit at a perfect right angle onto their axis, and this will not only cause stress to the gears but also will cause some stuttery motion, which you will see in some of the bodies of the final model. Here you can see one of the weird techniques I was talking about in order to compensate some of the inaccuracies I was causing with my hand drill. I'm cutting some 2-component epoxy putty, which I will then try to press into the hole because I drilled the hole not at the right spot. The length of the teeth of the gears will give you a little bit of room for errors, but sometimes having placed a hole just 1 or 2 millimeters too far to the right or left, this will cause the whole gear system not to work anymore. But on the upside, I really learned to love this 2 epoxy putty, and I can really highly recommend it for everybody who needs to fix something, because this stuff gets rock solid after it's hardened. Here you can see me working on Mars' orbit, which already is a bit longer than the orbit of the Earth and Mercury. And you also see that I needed to find a path around the other orbits in order to prevent other gears from getting in the way. And here you see the working gears, and although it works, you can see some of the axles are dancing around a little bit because they are not stabilized yet. Now I started working on Jupiter's orbit, and again you can see that I really need to go all around the other gears, which makes the path of the gear chain much longer. But since Jupiter runs so much slower than the inner planets, I can use this long chain of gears to slow down the rotation of the initial gears to match the correct ratio for Jupiter. And for those who might not know, if you attach a small gear to a large gear on the same axis, you are effectively reducing the speed by a factor that is given by the ratio of the number of teeth of the 2 gears. I will also put a link to the gear generator that helped me a lot to figure out the correct ratios in the description. Here you see me sanding down the holder for the motor that I built. I sadly lost the footage of how I built it, but basically I just cut a piece of an L-shaped aluminum profile to the desired length, and then I drilled some holes to fit the motor onto the L-shaped aluminum piece. The motor runs pretty slow with 12 evolutions per minute, and it has a torque of about 100 Newton centimeters, which I thought should be strong enough to drive all of the gears. As you can see, I used a large bevel gear which is attached directly to the motor, which is then connected to the rest of the gear system. Here I fitted in some steel threads into the wood so that I'm able to screw the motor in place. At this point I decided to cut the edges of the base plate to make it a bit more compact, because I was slowly realizing how the scale of the base plate will affect the overall scale of the model. Now I'm fixing the gears to the brass tubes using some superglue, and I also use some large washers that will act as spacers between the gears when the brass tubes lie on top of each other. And here's the part where I realized that I need some sort of stabilization, because the axes were just way too wobbly, and as soon as the motor applied force to the system, all of the axes are basically bent away from each other and the teeth of the gears are not interlocked anymore. That's why I decided to cut another plate of oak wood in the same dimensions as the base plate, which I would then use as a stabilizer for all of the axles. The idea basically was to fit some threaded rods all around the base plate. That's why I'm drilling the holes right here at the edge of the base plate, and then to fix the stabilizing plate at some height onto these rods. For some reason which I don't understand, I thought it might be reasonable to have 16 threaded rods to hold up the stabilizing plate, but in the end you will see me only using just 4. And what's even funnier is that I accidentally used the wrong drill size, and now you see I just put some epoxy putty into the holes that were too large just to cover them up. Here I realized that the threaded rods were not pointing perpendicular to the base plate, which again was probably caused by the inaccuracies of my power drill. Since I didn't see an easy way to fix this, I just decided to use only 4 of the rods, which fitted into the holes of the stabilization plate at the top. I now had to basically copy all of the holes that I already drilled into the base plate, and although there might be a better way of doing it, the safest way I thought was just to mark the positions where the axles are touching the top plate and then drill a hole at the marked position. That's why you see me putting the stabilization plate on and off again, marking and drilling one hole at a time, because I was afraid if I would do all of them at once, I might mess something up. Here I cut a thin aluminum plate to cover up the holes in the bottom of the base plate in order to prevent the axles from slipping through the holes and therefore changing the height of the gears relative to each other. And here you see all the gears running for the first time. In this shot you can see the large gears in the center of the video, which represents the final planetary motion. From bottom to top you see the gear running for Venus, which is running the fastest. Then you have the gear for the Earth, then the gear for Mars, and then the two on top are for Jupiter, and the last one is for Saturn. In case you're wondering why Mercury doesn't have its own gear, Mercury in this model is not represented by a moving ring. It's instead basically a fixed ring around the Sun, which you will see in the end. So with the whole gearbox now set up, we will come to the first platonic body, the octahedron. And you can see here a 3D model that I designed in SketchUp 3D in order to get an understanding of how I need to cut the wood to build the model. And here you see one extracted edge of the model. I would need to build 12 of those edges in order to complete the octahedron, which, as the name suggests, consists out of 8 equal triangles as faces. Here you see me measuring the raw walnut profiles that I would then cut to the desired length. I decided to only use walnut in combination with brass because I really like the look of the dark walnut wood together with the golden look of the brass, which is also a usual material for astronomical models from the past. After cutting all of the pieces into the desired length, I used an electronic angle measurement tool in order to draw the correct angles I needed to cut into the wood on each of those edge pieces. With the other models I used a bit of a different technique, which I will explain when we come to that. One of the biggest questions I had in mind the whole time when I was thinking about the model was how would I be able to cut such precise angles into the wood, because I knew from previous projects that using something like a miter saw sometimes is just not accurate enough. In addition to the lack of accuracy, there are also some angles that I just couldn't cut with my miter saw, so I needed to find a different way and approach of cutting precise angles in the wood and do this somewhat consistently. And the solution to this problem was, instead of cutting these angles into the wood, I would slowly grind the wood away until I have the wood in the desired angle that I wanted to. So I went out and bought a relatively cheap belt grinder that you will see me using throughout this video in order to get the angles that I need. The octahedron, apart from the cube, was probably the most easiest model of all of the bodies that I had to build. And I think the main reason for this was just that the edges of the octahedron were so small. After I had all of the 12 edges cut, I just went on and glued the edges together to the triangles that would make up the faces of the octahedron. Again, since this was the first platonic body that I built, I gained quite a lot of knowledge that I would later use to improve my build of the bigger and more complex shapes. To help me hold everything in place while I'm gluing everything together, I just used some white modeling clay. Since I wanted to keep my model as modular as possible, I decided not to glue the whole model together, but rather have one half of the model sit on top of the other half of the model so that I could just remove the top to gain access, for example, to the sun or to the light, whatever might need maintenance down the line. Now, I have not talked about the spherical shells that I needed to build for this model yet. Although I really love the way that Kepler imagined this model, one thing that I didn't like about these spherical shells was that these spherical shells would basically block the view of half the model. So I really wanted to have something that is see-through so that you can see the whole model at all times. That's why I decided to go with a much simpler look and design in the form of a spherical wireframe made out of brass tubes. And in order to do this, I bought a very cheap and very broken device that is used for wire bending, but it did the job fairly well, as you can see here. For each of the platonic bodies, I would need to bend 3 identical rings of brass, which I will then cut into smaller pieces in order to build a 3-dimensional wireframe of a spherical shell. And here you can see me soldering the pieces together. I don't have all of the footage of this shell structure, but for the other models I do. So if you are interested in how I build it exactly, then just skip to one of the other models where I built the shell and show you a more detailed view of the build. Here I'm trying to drill a hole through the bottom of the octahedron in order to fit the central axis that will hold the sun through it. At this point I'm drilling very tiny holes into the edges of the octahedron in order to fit some tiny magnets into them that would hold the upper part of the octahedron in place so that it wouldn't fall off if you would turn the octahedron on its head. After I designed the icosahedron in SketchUp 3D, I realized that this build would be much more complicated than the octahedron, because here you can see, while the mathematical model of the icosahedron consists out of 30 edges, I would need to build each edge out of 2 separate wooden parts, so I would need in total 60 edges that would then make up the 20 faces that are equal triangles. This build essentially starts out the same as with the octahedron, so first cutting the wood into the desired lengths, and after that grinding the angles into the wood. In this case I came up with a more efficient way of sketching the angles onto the wooden pieces. I used a software called Papercura, which can be used to unfold 3-dimensional shapes into a 2-dimensional plane and then print out the 2-dimensional plane on a piece of paper, for example, to then fold it up into the 3-dimensional shape. So essentially what I did, I printed out a 2-dimensional template of my 3-dimensional model, which I could then wrap around my wooden pieces to show me where I needed to cut the angles. And here I wrapped the template around the piece of wood in order to then sketch the angles onto the wooden piece. Here you can see how I also used the paper template in order to check if I grinded the angles correctly and if everything fits. And in this case there was a little bit of wood sticking out of the template, so I just marked the edge with a pencil and then take it back to the belt grinder. And then, as you see, this fits now perfectly snug into the paper template. Another thing I used Papercura for was to print out the shape of the triangles for the icosahedron faces, so that I could glue the triangles on top of those templates together, so that I could be sure that all of the triangles had the exact same shape and size. After I glued the triangles together, I fixed some minor imperfections using just some wooden glue and sawdust, and then sanded all of the wood down to 2000 grit. The sanding part for me is usually the most time consuming and boring part, but it really makes the model look more professional in the end. And what I did to make sure that everything fit together perfectly before I glued everything together was to just use some sticky tape to see if everything fits. And once I was sure that everything fitted together, I then started gluing the pieces together. So here you can see the model hold together basically just by sticky tape. I don't have footage of me gluing all of the pieces together, but I think you can imagine how it worked out. I also had to drill a hole in this model from the underside to make sure that the brass tube of the octahedron would fit through the icosahedron. Here again I use a little hand drill in order to drill some holes for the magnets that will then hold the top of the icosahedron in place. Now onto the spherical shell for the icosahedron. I again first start by just using the wire bender in order to bend the brass tubes of the desired thickness to the desired diameter. Here I soldered together the two ends of the brass tube in order to form one solid ring. I basically repeat this process and then cut the next ring into 4 equally sized pieces, which will then form the wireframe for the spherical shell. This piece here is called a set collar, and I will use this in order to fix the spherical shell onto the axis, but at the same time this set collar allows me to remove the whole platonic body, including the wireframe if I want to. Here you can see me marking the positions where I would need to drill a hole into the steel. And although I didn't have a drill press before, you will see me now using my drill stand that I acquired at the time, which basically can hold a regular drill and can be used as a regular drill press. Without this drill stand I would not have been able to drill a hole into these steel set collars, so I think this investment was definitely worth it. Although I must say drilling holes into steel is definitely not one of my major hobbies. I really learned the hard way how not to drill holes into steel, and I actually wasted I think 5 different set collars. You see me trying to fit the cut brass pieces into the drilled holes of the set collar before I start to solder everything together. And after a lot of sanding using sandpaper and steel wool, the parts for the icosahedron and the brass sphere are finally done. Next will be the dodecahedron, which to me is the most interesting of all the models, because for some reason this sometimes looks asymmetric to me, although I know that it's not, but something about this Platonic body looks strange to me. The dodecahedron consists of 12 equal faces, which are made out of 5 edges each, which in total adds up to 30 edges. But since one edge needs to be constructed out of 2 wooden pieces, I need in total 60 wooden edges to build this model. As you've probably already noticed, I increased the thickness of the wood for the larger models, which should create a sense of depth if you look into the center of the model at the end. Since most of the working steps are pretty similar to the icosahedron, I will not talk as much about the different steps. As with the icosahedron, I use some sticky tape to put together the whole dodecahedron model to make sure that everything fits together nicely, before then partially removing the sticky tape, gluing a piece in place, and removing the next piece of sticky tape, and so on. Here you see me mixing some 2-component glue in order to attach the wooden dodecahedron to the brass rings. Here you can see now all the modular components for the first 3 platonic bodies, which can now be attached to their brass tubes. And here you see the first 3 bodies combined. I just throw the table tennis ball into the center just to get an idea on how this will look in the end. Probably the most annoying build of all of the bodies. Not necessarily the most difficult, but definitely the most annoying. Because as you can see here, all of the edges are again made up out of 2 different edges. And since this model is so large, I needed to file away a huge portion of those edges. And since I don't have a table saw, this was a lot of work and a very time-consuming part of the build. Here you see me again cutting out the paper templates in order to have a 3-dimensional paper shell that I could wrap around the wood in order to find the angles. And here comes the annoying part where I use the power tool in order to grind away most of the wood of this edge before I took it to the belt grinder, because otherwise I would have grinded this wood for probably hours only to finish one of those edges. Here you can see one of the 12 different edges that I sanded, and 2 of those edges would in the end form one edge of the tetrahedron. I glued those pieces together using 2 ferrules and a vise to make sure that the natural bend that some of those wooden pieces had wouldn't affect the straightness of the final piece in the end. Now with all the pieces done, I glued them together, making sure again to be able to lift off the top of the model if I would need to. Here I'm adding some rather strong neodymium magnets that are easily able to hold the weight of the wood together. I realized now that I would face another problem with the brass rings for the tetrahedron, because the thickness of the brass tubes that I chose for the tetrahedron was too large in order to fit the brass tube onto my tube bending machine that I used for the other models. So the only real way to bend those brass tubes was to do it by hand, which you can see me doing now using a big round gas canister, which had approximately the radius that I would need. Again, most of the next steps are more or less the same compared to the dodecahedron and icosahedron, so I will not go into too much explanatory detail here. At this point of the build I was extremely happy with what I've done so far and that everything seemed to come together nicely, and I was just looking forward to getting this project done. Although the cube is the largest platonic solid of this model, it really was the easiest to build. I could just use my miter saw to cut 45-degree angles into the edges and then gluing the parts together. I wanted to limit the size of the cube edges to around 50 centimeters to prevent the model from getting too large. I also decided that I won't build the outermost ring of the whole model, because as I said in the beginning, this ring would need to have a diameter of around 1 meter, which would just be too large to fit into my living room at some point. The only real difficult part with the cube was to get it aligned straight with the rest of the model so it doesn't look tilted in the end. Obviously this model deserves a nice wooden box to hide the gearbox and all the electronics inside of it. To fit the rest of the look of the model, I decided to use walnut wood as well, and I actually got really lucky online and bought some very nice walnut plates for a reasonable price. The only thing I needed to do was to glue those plates together to form the appropriate size that I needed to build the box. One major thing I was struggling with when building this box, which I don't show in the video, is the bending of the wooden plates. But I found a really nice trick online to get rid of bends in wooden boards. So what you need to do is make the board wet on the side that is bent upwards and then use a hot iron and iron out the bend. The heat and the moisture will cause the wood grain to expand and therefore bending the wood backwards so that it counteracts the bend from the other side. One of the things that I really wanted to have with this box was a seamless edge, and this was kind of a problem because I already said that I don't have a table saw. And without a table saw, it's much more difficult to get a nice 45-degree angle into the wood. So what I decided to do was basically the same thing that I did with the tetrahedron build, where I just needed to file away a lot of the wood by hand and then using my belt grinder in order to really get this nice smooth 45-degree angle in there. What took me many hours to do by hand would have probably taken 10 minutes on a table saw, so I will probably get a table saw as my next bigger purchase. I just stayed away from table saws up until now because I heard some horror stories from some very terrible kickbacks that happened and people who are losing their fingers and stuff, so I thought I probably shouldn't get a table saw if I don't absolutely need it. Now I made sure that everything fitted together nicely before I started gluing the walls into place. Although I like to wait with the wood varnish till the end of the project, I decided that it would be a good idea to use it right now because I wanted to prevent further bending of the wood by the humidity of the air. Here I'm drilling holes to create an attachment point for another large bearing that sits on top of the stabilizing plate of the gearbox, which will stabilize all of the brass tubes that will hold the platonic bodies and will prevent those from wiggling around. Now I will attach some handles onto the top lid of the box, because there will be some magnets holding the top lid in place and you will need to have some sort of handle to be able to open the box if you need to get inside. Now I drill some holes into the wall of the box in order to fit some large neodymium magnets that will then hold the top lid in place. In order to make it easier for me to lift the gearbox in and out the box, I also decided to put some handles onto the gearbox. Here I decided to put some brass handles on the sides of the box, which will improve the visual look of the box, as well as make it easier to move the box around. Here I'm adding some small brass feet. When I ordered those, I honestly thought they were a bit larger, but I decided to go with those anyway. Here I'm drilling 2 holes for the electronics connections, one for the sunlight and the other one for the rotation of the bodies. I thought it would be nice, since the motor is quite loud, that you can use the light of the sun independent from the motor. Here I'm soldering the cables to the female plug side that will then sit in the hole that I just drilled in the wall of the box. To cover up the gaps between the top lid and the body of the box, I decided to use some L-shaped brass profiles that I will then glue to the edges of the top lid. What I didn't really like about these L profiles was that the brass looked very yellow, so I decided to use a patina for brass that will actually make the brass look older and make it fit the rest of the brass that I used. Using the patina is very straightforward. You just dilute it with some water depending on how strong the effect should be, and then you put your brass into the solution and wait for some time, and here you can see a speed up video of the discoloring that the patina causes to the brass. Now I'm sanding off the very dark top coat of the brass, and underneath the brass is taking a much nicer, less yellow color. Here you see a direct comparison. On the left you see the untreated brass, and on the right side the patina treated brass. After I finished all the brass profiles, I glued them onto the top lid so that they can cover the gaps between the top lid and the body of the box. I also decided to put some brass corner pieces onto the edges of the box, and you see me here now preparing those 4 corner pieces. Whenever you want to glue brass on brass or metal on metal in general, or even metal on wood, I can't stress enough how important it is to sand the piece that you want to glue in order to increase the surface area of this piece, and this will really help the glue to bind those 2 pieces together. Here you see the brass sign that I ordered for this project. Since I don't have an engraving machine, I ordered this online. And it basically states the name of Johannes Kepler, then the name of the model, and then my name and the year of the build at the end. Now I will talk a little bit about how I created the sun. This was a very fun part of the build, and as I already said, I used a table tennis ball which I cut in half. But first I melted a little hole into the plastic of the ball so that the ball would fit onto the brass tube that would be holding the sun. You see me here using the LED that I want to put inside in order to see through the table tennis ball, and because of the way these table tennis balls are created, they have a seam in the inside which can actually tell you where the center of the two halves are. So I basically used this VSauce in order to see the seam and cut right along those lines. Since I also wanted to represent Mercury's orbit, I decided to put a brass ring around the center of the ball, which would also help to hide the cutting line where the two halves meet. Sadly, my ring bending machine couldn't bend a ring of the radius that small, so I needed to bend it myself, but it worked out pretty well by just using some round objects to wrap it around and then just measure if the radius is the one that I need. Here you can see the ball has still some part of the label on it, but using some acetone I could just wipe it off, so the ball looks 100% clean at the end. For the LED I used the E4 socket, which you can see me working on here. I basically tried to grind off some of the ceramics so that the socket can fit into the brass tube. In order to make the top part fit onto the bottom part, I used a small piece of plastic and glued it onto the inside, which basically works like a lip that will hold the two halves together. It's not a very strong connection, but it doesn't need to because it will sit in the center and won't be moving anyway. Here you can see me putting everything together, and I have to be honest, I'm very proud of how this table tennis ball sun worked out. One important thing was to make sure that the LED wouldn't get too hot, so what I did was just a long time test. I powered on the LED, left it on for a couple of hours and saw if something happened to the plastic, but the LED only got warm to the touch, not even hot. Here you can see me working on the cable connection for all the electronics. I already fitted a pair of cables through the steel tube in the center of the build, and now I'm trying to fit the custom-made socket for the LED onto the brass tubes. Obviously, since there are cables attached to the socket can't just rotate with the other tubes, so I need to make sure that this socket is detached from the rotating axles. Now, after 1 year of build, this was by far the most exciting part of the build for me. But before I put everything inside of the box, I decided to use some lubrication oil in order to reduce friction and hopefully some noise of the gears. So you can see me putting the gearbox inside the box that I built and also connecting all the electronics to the plugs in the wall of the box. Now before I put on all the different models, I decided to put on some wood varnish onto them so they are protected and the grain of the wood gets a bit more emphasized. At this point it must have been around 6 in the morning after working the whole night, so I was very tired, but the excitement just kept me up, seeing my build for the first time combined and working. Before I do the final reveal, I'm just showing you how I built the stand for this thing. Very basic, just a plate of oak wood and then just using 4 wooden legs that I would screw to this plate. And in order to fit the whole narrative of a solar system, I decided to cover the wood with a black stain. Just to say a few final words, I'm incredibly happy with what this project has become. It was by far the largest and most difficult undertaking I've ever tackled so far. I've learned an incredible amount, and not only in terms of manual labor, but also how to deal with stressful situations and how to solve problems that seem unsurmountable. Around 500 working hours and a good chunk of my money went into this project, and even though things didn't always go according to plan, I think it was worth every single minute and dollar. I hope I didn't bore you to death and you enjoyed my little journey through this project. If you are interested in any specifics that I might have left out, or if you have some constructive criticism or advice from me, feel free to leave a comment under this video. But for now, that's all that I wanted to say. Thank you for watching.